The night of November 1st, 1943, on the ocean surrounding Bougainville Island, Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori stood upon the bridge of the heavy cruiser Miyoko, utterly convinced of impending victory. His naval contingent sliced through the gloom of the Solomon Sea at a speed of 28 knots, 8 vessels sailing in a meticulously ordered formation. The air was heavy with the moist heat of the tropics, and the visibility was limited to approximately 4,000 yards on this moonless expanse. These were the ideal conditions for what the Imperial Japanese Navy executed with unparalleled expertise worldwide: night surface engagements. Omori was at the helm of a formidable fleet. 2 heavy cruisers, the Miyoko and the Haguro, each boasting a displacement exceeding 13,000 tons and armed with 10 8-inch guns. 2 light cruisers, the Sendai and the Agano, equipped with their batteries of 5.5-inch weaponry. 6 destroyers were positioned to provide screening. Their objective was deceptively simple: to intercept and obliterate the American invasion armada that had established a beachhead at Empress Augusta Bay mere hours prior. Their orders were to annihilate the transport ships, bombard the landing zones, and drive the American forces back into the sea. The Japanese forces had executed similar operations successfully before. At Savo Island in August of 1942, a Japanese cruiser contingent had launched a surprise assault upon an Allied squadron safeguarding the Guadalcanal landings. In less than 60 minutes, the Japanese had managed to sink 4 Allied cruisers and inflict damage upon others, while sustaining minimal harm themselves. This had been one of the most decisively one-sided naval triumphs in modern history, achieved entirely under the cloak of darkness, through the superiority of their optics, the excellence of their training, and aggressive tactics that the American forces were demonstrably incapable of countering in the dark. If you are finding this in-depth exploration of the narrative engaging, please consider subscribing and sharing your global location in the comments. That prior engagement had been fought using established naval methodologies, the traditional approach to warfare for centuries: identifying the enemy first, closing the distance to an effective engagement range, and bringing their armaments to bear before the adversary could react. The Japanese had every justifiable reason to anticipate a repetition of that success on this particular night. Their lookouts were considered the most proficient within any naval force globally. Their optical instruments, particularly the immense rangefinders mounted on their cruisers, were of exceptional quality. Their strategic doctrine specifically emphasized nocturnal combat, recognizing the inherent struggles faced by Western navies in such conditions. The Japanese meticulously practiced and refined these techniques, building their tactical approaches around them. What Admiral Omori remained unaware of, what was beyond his comprehension as his vessels propelled through the humid tropical night, was that the fundamental paradigm of naval warfare had undergone a radical transformation in the 26 months since the engagement at Savo Island. The American forces advancing from the opposing direction were not depending on human eyesight or optical rangefinders to locate their targets. They had developed a revolutionary capability, something entirely absent from Japanese inventories, a technology that would render centuries of naval tradition obsolete within a single night. The Americans possessed operational radar. At that precise moment, approximately 40 nautical miles to the southeast, Rear Admiral Aaron S. Merrill stood within the Combat Information Center of the light cruiser Montpellier, observing green blips materialize upon a radar display. His assigned naval contingent, designated Task Force 39, comprised 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers. On paper, this force was outmatched by the Japanese fleet advancing towards them. The Japanese possessed heavier ordnance, larger vessels, and more substantial armor plating. However, Merrill possessed an advantage Omori lacked. He had precise knowledge of the enemy's exact location, their velocity, and their intended course. While the Japanese were still scanning the darkness with binoculars and rangefinders, the Americans were tracking them on electronic screens. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay was poised to become a stark illustration of the consequences when one navy engages in blind combat while the other operates with complete situational awareness. It would serve as a profound lesson in technological obsolescence, demonstrating how a singular capability could completely nullify decades of established tactical superiority. And for the crew aboard the light cruiser Sendai, leading the Japanese formation at high speed through the darkness. This would regrettably be their final engagement. To grasp the Japanese expectations for that night, one must understand the core principles upon which their entire surface fleet doctrine was constructed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been diligently preparing for nocturnal combat since the early 1920s, and by 1943, they believed they had perfected this art. Night engagements offered several strategic advantages for Japan. The nation's industrial output was considerably less robust than that of the United States or Great Britain. Japan could not compete with Western navies in terms of overall tonnage or the sheer number of vessels. However, under the cover of darkness, numerical superiority became less critical, and visual acuity diminished in importance. What truly mattered were the quality of training, the level of discipline, and the sophistication of optical equipment. These were the domains where Japan could contend, and indeed, excel. Japanese naval architects meticulously designed their ships with nocturnal combat as a primary consideration. Heavy cruisers like the Myoko were outfitted with enormous rangefinders, some featuring base lengths exceeding 40 feet. These substantial optical instruments were capable of measuring distances with remarkable accuracy, even in low-light conditions. They were strategically positioned high on the superstructure to maximize the field of observation. Japanese cruiser bridges were intentionally tall, affording lookouts the optimal vantage point to discern enemy vessels against the horizon. The training regimen was equally rigorous. Japanese lookouts dedicated years to honing their nocturnal vision. They practiced identifying the silhouettes of warships in complete darkness. They trained to detect the subtle phosphorescence of bow waves from distances that seemed impossible. It was said that senior lookouts could differentiate between various classes of warships based solely on the faint distinctions in their superstructure profiles as seen in silhouette. Whether this assertion was entirely factual or embellished by legend was secondary. The Japanese Naval Command believed it, and more importantly, their adversaries were convinced of its veracity. Japanese optical technology was genuinely outstanding. Their binoculars, especially those manufactured by esteemed firms such as Nippon Kogaku, later known as Nikon, were regarded as among the finest in the world. Their specialized night binoculars incorporated large objective lenses to capture maximum available light, and the optical coatings were of superior quality. Combined with the keen eyesight of their well-trained personnel, these instruments granted Japanese lookouts a tangible advantage in nocturnal operations. The tactical doctrine built upon these strengths was characterized by aggression and extensive rehearsal. Japanese cruiser formations routinely practiced coordinated night assaults. They would approach at high speeds, often in a column formation to minimize their observable profile. Upon establishing contact, they would execute a turn to present their full broadsides and commence firing at relatively close ranges, typically between 8,000 and 12,000 yards. Their doctrine prioritized swift, overwhelming volleys designed to incapacitate enemy vessels before they could mount an effective counterattack. This was not merely theoretical. At Savo Island, Japanese cruisers had unequivocally demonstrated the devastating potential of this doctrine. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's fleet had approached undetected, achieved complete surprise, and utterly decimated the Allied screening force in what the United States Navy would subsequently categorize as one of its most catastrophic defeats. The engagement lasted a mere 32 minutes from the initial shots to the Japanese withdrawal. 4 Allied cruisers were either sinking or had already sunk, and over 1,000 Allied sailors had perished. Japanese casualties were negligible. The conclusions drawn by the Japanese from the Savo Island experience were accurate. Night combat was their forte. They intensified their training, refined their strategies, and entered subsequent engagements with unwavering confidence that darkness served as their ally. American and Allied commanders drew their own, contrasting conclusions. Engaging Japanese forces at night through conventional means was to be avoided whenever possible. The United States Navy initiated the development of novel tactics, revamped training programs, and, most crucially, pursued new technologies to counteract the Japanese advantage. By November of 1943, these technological advancements were poised to undergo their inaugural test under genuine combat conditions during a major surface engagement. The American response to the defeat at Savo Island was not immediate, but proved to be thorough. The U.S. Navy recognized that confronting the Japanese at night using traditional methods was an unwinnable proposition. American lookouts, irrespective of their extensive training, could not match the decades of specialized experience possessed by the Japanese. American optical equipment, while good, did not surpass Japanese standards. The Navy required a fundamentally different approach. That approach was radar. Radar itself was not a novel invention by 1943. The British had employed it to decisive effect during the Battle of Britain. Early warning radar systems had provided fighter command with the crucial intelligence needed to intercept German bomber formations. However, air search radar and surface search radar presented distinct challenges with unique technical complexities. Detecting large aircraft at high altitudes was a comparatively straightforward endeavor. Detecting ships on the ocean's surface and distinguishing them from wave clutter and meteorological returns necessitated different frequencies and distinct antenna designs. The breakthrough arrived with the advancement of microwave radar, specifically the cavity magnetron. Developed at Britain's University of Birmingham in 1940, this device was capable of generating high-frequency radio waves at centimeter wavelengths, dramatically enhancing resolution and reducing antenna dimensions. This groundbreaking technology was shared with the United States in September of 1940, when the Tizard mission delivered a cavity magnetron to American scientists. Within months, American electronics firms were actively developing practical applications for the Navy. The culmination of these efforts was the SG surface search radar, developed by Raytheon and first deployed on U.S. warships in early 1942. The SG radar operated at a wavelength of 10 centimeters, providing it with the resolution necessary to detect ships at tactically significant ranges. More importantly, it possessed the capability to track multiple targets simultaneously, accurately determine their range, and provide bearing information precise enough for fire control calculations. By late 1943, the SG radar had become standard equipment aboard U.S. cruisers and destroyers. Its antenna, a distinctive rectangular array, rotated continuously, sweeping the horizon with electronic pulses. Detected returns would appear on a plan position indicator display, a circular screen presenting both range and bearing to the identified objects. Operators could differentiate between various contacts, monitor their movements, and relay critical information to the Combat Information Center and fire control stations. The tactical implications were revolutionary. With radar, American commanders no longer relied on visual confirmation to ascertain enemy locations. Ships could maintain radar contact at distances far exceeding visual detection capabilities, even in broad daylight, and certainly far surpassing what human lookouts could achieve in darkness. Fire control computers could calculate firing solutions based on radar data, enabling ships to engage targets they had never physically seen. Admiral Merrill's Task Force 39 had been specifically organized and trained to leverage the full potential of radar technology. His flagship, the Montpellier, along with its sister ships Cleveland, Columbia, and Denver, were all equipped with SG radar. They had extensively practiced radar-directed nocturnal gunnery and training exercises. They had established protocols for sharing radar intelligence between ships, coordinating maneuvers, and executing firing solutions based entirely on electronic data rather than visual observation. The operational doctrine was still undergoing refinement. Radar was not infallible. It possessed blind spots, particularly in rough seas where wave returns could obscure targets. It demanded skilled operators for accurate display interpretation, and equipment was susceptible to malfunction or combat damage. However, when operational, radar provided intelligence that was simply unattainable through any other means. It empowered commanders to perceive the entire battlefield, to track enemy movements in real time, and to position their forces for maximum strategic advantage. On the night of November 1st, 1943, these two contrasting doctrines, one perfected over decades, the other barely 2 years old, were on a collision course in the darkness surrounding Bougainville. The Japanese fleet was proceeding northward at high velocity, confident in their perceived superiority in night fighting, relying on methodologies that had previously secured them victories. The American forces lay in wait, monitoring the Japanese advance on their radar screens, prepared to engage in a manner never before attempted. The critical question was not whether the Americans possessed a technological advantage, but rather if they could translate that advantage into tactical success before Japanese ordnance found its mark. The SG radar installed aboard the Montpellier was a model SG-1, manufactured by Raytheon. The system comprised a transmitter generating 50 kilowatts of peak power at a 10-centimeter wavelength, an antenna array measuring approximately 4 feet by 2 feet that rotated at 15 revolutions per minute, and a plan position indicator live display situated within the Combat Information Center. Its effective detection range against a target the size of a cruiser under optimal conditions was approximately 30,000 yards, roughly 15 nautical miles. Against smaller targets such as destroyers, this range diminished to perhaps 20,000 yards. The radar operator was positioned before a circular display screen 12 inches in diameter. The center of the screen represented the radar antenna's location, which also indicated the ship's position. Concentric circles marked range increments, typically graduated in thousands of yards. A bright sweep line rotated around the screen in sync with the antenna's rotation, updating information with each revolution. When a transmitted radar pulse encountered a solid object and reflected back, the returning signal manifested as a bright spot, or PIP, on the screen at the corresponding range and bearing. Operating the SG radar demanded a level of skill and experience that American radar operators were still actively developing. In late 1943, the operator had to differentiate genuine contacts from spurious returns caused by meteorological conditions, sea clutter, or equipment anomalies. Rain squalls could appear as large, amorphous blobs on the screen. Heavy seas generated clutter near the display's center, where wave action reflected radar energy. The operator needed to recognize these patterns and mentally filter them out while simultaneously identifying actual ship contacts. The radar information was channeled to the Combat Information Center, a compartment situated deep within the ship's hull, where officers meticulously plotted tactical data on large charting tables. Each radar contact was assigned a unique designation and manually tracked on the plot. Officers calculated the contact's course and speed based on successive radar positions. This intelligence was then communicated to the bridge and to the fire control stations, where gunnery officers prepared firing solutions. The fire control system itself represented another significant technological advantage. American cruisers utilized Mark 8 fire control radar for their main battery gunnery, a system distinct from the SG search radar. The Mark 8 provided highly precise range data for the fire control computers. These computers, electromechanical devices weighing several tons, automatically computed the required gun elevation and deflection based on target range, bearing, speed, and the ship's own motion. Gunners adjusted their weapons to align with pointers receiving electrical signals from the computer. When the pointers synchronized, the guns were accurately aimed for the current firing solution. The Japanese possessed no comparable systems. Their fire control relied on optical rangefinders and mechanical calculators. A Japanese cruiser's main battery director incorporated a massive coincidence rangefinder, an optical instrument that determined distance by aligning two images of the target, viewed through telescopes situated at opposite ends of a substantial baseline. The rangefinder operator manipulated controls until the two images perfectly coincided, and the mechanism then translated this adjustment into a distance measurement. This system functioned exceptionally well during daylight or under conditions of clear visibility. Japanese rangefinders were accurate, and their operators were highly proficient. However, at night, the system's efficacy was entirely contingent upon the ability to see the target with sufficient clarity to align the images. In complete darkness or at extended ranges, this task became exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. The Japanese attempted to compensate by employing searchlights to illuminate targets during the final phases of an attack. However, searchlights also served to reveal the attacking ship's position to every enemy vessel within range. Japanese fire control computers were mechanical devices that computed firing solutions based on manual inputs from the rangefinder and target-bearing measurements. They were slower than their American electromechanical counterparts and less capable of responding to rapid target maneuvers. More crucially, they could not receive electronic input from radar, as Japanese ships generally lacked fire control radar capabilities. This disparity extended to their doctrine and organizational structure. American vessels featured dedicated combat information centers staffed by officers specifically trained to manage radar intelligence and tactical plotting. Japanese cruisers lacked any comparable facilities. Radar information, when available on Japanese ships equipped with rudimentary air search radars, was directly relayed to the bridge, where the commanding officer and his staff had to process it, along with all other incoming data, while simultaneously directing the ship's movements and managing the engagement. Admiral Merrill's strategic plan systematically exploited these advantages. His 4 cruisers would operate in a column formation, maintaining a speed of 28 knots. The destroyers were organized into 2 divisions positioned on the flanks, ready to launch torpedo attacks or screen against Japanese destroyers. The cruisers would depend on radar to detect the Japanese contingent while remaining undetected themselves. Upon establishing contact, Merrill intended to maneuver his column to maintain optimal firing positions while continuously using radar to track the Japanese movements. The plan necessitated precise coordination. All 4 cruisers had to execute turns in unison to simultaneously unmask their broadsides. The fire control system needed to allocate targets efficiently, preventing multiple ships from engaging the same Japanese vessel while leaving others unattacked. The destroyers were required to synchronize their torpedo attacks with the cruiser's gunnery to maximize disruption within the Japanese formation. Every facet of the plan hinged on maintaining accurate radar tracking of the Japanese fleet while simultaneously preventing the Japanese from acquiring similar intelligence regarding American positions. At 23:45 hours on November 1st, the Montpellier's SG radar detected multiple contacts bearing 315 degrees true, at a range of 31,000 yards. The Japanese fleet had been precisely located where intelligence reports had predicted. The radar operator reported 7 distinct contacts, a figure later revised to 8 as the returns resolved with greater clarity. The Combat Information Center commenced tracking these contacts, calculating their course at 130 degrees at 28 knots. The Japanese were heading almost directly towards the American transport area at Empress Augusta Bay. Admiral Merrill possessed his intelligence. The enemy was 15.5 nautical miles distant, moving at high speed and completely oblivious to their detection. The Americans had achieved precisely what Japanese doctrine deemed impossible. They had located the enemy first at night, at a range where visual detection was utterly unattainable. Now, the challenge was to translate this information advantage into tactical success. At 23:50 hours, Admiral Merrill ordered his task force to increase speed to 30 knots and alter course to intercept the Japanese contingent. His cruisers remained invisible to Japanese lookouts, but the radar picture indicated the 2 formations were converging. The range steadily decreased: 28,000 yards, 25,000, 22,000. Still, there was no indication that the Japanese were aware of the presence of American surface vessels in the vicinity. Admiral Omori, aboard the Myoko, had received reports of American ships near Empress Augusta Bay, but his intelligence suggested they were primarily transports and their destroyer escorts, vessels likely to retreat rather than engage. His fleet had been detected by American aircraft earlier that day, but he had no reason to suspect that American surface combatants were strategically positioned to intercept him. The sentinels scanned the inky blackness, their gazes fixed on the horizon, seeking any sign of American vessels silhouetted against the formidable bulk of Bougainville Island. As yet, nothing registered. This lack of immediate detection was entirely expected. They wouldn't anticipate identifying targets until they closed the distance to roughly 10 to 12,000 yards. Under the prevailing conditions, at 01:30 hours on November the 2nd, the range had already dwindled to 20,000 yards. Admiral Merrill issued the order for his formation to alter course to 270 degrees, steering a path almost directly westward. This maneuver strategically positioned his cruisers to intercept the approaching Japanese fleet. It was a textbook naval maneuver, the classic tactic of crossing the T. Every armament on his 4 cruisers would then bear upon the enemy vessels, while the Japanese would be constrained to engage solely with their forward guns until they completed their turns to unmask their broadsides. This represented an optimal tactical advantage, achieved entirely without the enemy gaining any inkling of the American presence. Aboard the Sendai, the lead light cruiser of the Japanese formation, lookouts continued their diligent watch. Captain Toshio Kobayashi stood upon the bridge, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, piercing the gloom ahead. The Sendai was purpose-built for such a role, swift, agile, equipped with superior optical instruments and manned by a seasoned crew. She displaced 5,500 tons, carried 7 5.5-inch guns, and could achieve a speed of 35 knots. Her lookouts were considered among the finest in the fleet, expected to detect any American ships long before the Americans could detect them. Yet, they detected nothing. At 01:47 hours, with the range reduced to 18,500 yards, Admiral Merrill commanded his cruisers to open fire. The directive was transmitted electronically. No searchlights pierced the darkness to illuminate the targets. No visual confirmation preceded the order to fire. The fire control radars had already locked onto specific Japanese vessels. The fire control computers had meticulously calculated firing solutions. The guns were already trained on targets that the crews could not see and would never see with their own eyes. Second CTA at approximately 2,900 words. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Montpellier's primary armament consisted of 12 6-inch guns housed in 4 triple turrets. At 04:08 hours, all 12 guns discharged simultaneously. The night sky was rent by a blinding flash, visible for miles around. Moments later, the Cleveland, Columbia, and Denver added their firepower to the barrage. 48 6-inch guns unleashed coordinated volleys, sending over 2 tons of steel shrieking through the darkness towards Japanese ships that remained utterly unaware of the American cruiser's presence. The initial salvos landed in the vicinity of the Sendai. Massive plumes of water erupted near the vessel as shells impacted the sea. Some rounds found their mark. 6-inch armor-piercing shells, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, punched through the Sendai's relatively thin hull plating and continued on, passing completely through the ship before detonating on the far side or plunging into the ocean. The cruiser shuddered violently with each impact. Sailors were thrown from their feet. Equipment was ripped from its mountings. On the Sendai's bridge, the reaction was not one of fear or panic, but utter bewilderment. They were under bombardment. At night, from a direction where no enemy vessels had been detected, at a range where visual identification should be impossible, the brilliant gun flashes from the American cruisers were now visible, erupting suddenly from the darkness at an unbelievable distance. The mathematics simply didn't add up. If they could now see the gun flashes, the American ships had to be at least 15,000 yards away, likely further. But how had the Americans known precisely where to aim? How had they achieved such accurate fire without the aid of searchlights? Without any indication that they had even detected the Japanese formation, Captain Kobayashi ordered an emergency turn to starboard, attempting to bring the Sendai's full broadside to bear and return fire. The light cruiser heeled sharply as her rudder went hard over, but the American fire control systems had tracked the maneuver via radar. The fire control computers recalculated instantaneously. The subsequent American salvos adjusted for the Sendai's evasive action, tracking the ship through its turn. More shells struck home. The forward turret was hit and rendered inoperable. Fires erupted amidships. The bridge structure was repeatedly struck. Admiral Omori, positioned several thousand yards behind the Sendai in his flagship Myoko, faced his own crisis of comprehension. His lead ship was under accurate gunfire from an enemy force that should not have been there, firing from ranges that should preclude accurate shooting, hitting targets in darkness that conventional doctrine dictated should be undetectable. His meticulously planned night attack strategy hinged on the assumption that the Japanese would detect the enemy first, at close to effective range, and open fire from a position of superiority. Instead, the Americans had sprung a trap, achieving surprise through some method he couldn't fathom. Omori ordered his heavy cruisers to turn towards the visible gun flashes and commence firing. The Myoko and Haguro began launching salvos from their 8-inch guns, but they were firing at the visible muzzle flashes, not at the actual ship positions calculated by sophisticated fire control equipment. The heavy shells, each weighing over 250 pounds, fell in wide patterns around the American cruisers, but achieved few direct hits. The American ships were continuously maneuvering based on radar intelligence, turning to evade torpedo assaults from Japanese destroyers, adjusting their positions to maintain optimal firing range. The Japanese were firing at where the Americans had been moments before, not where they were at that instant. The Sendai absorbed immense punishment in the opening minutes of the engagement. American 6-inch shells continued to hammer her hull and superstructure. Each impact inflicted catastrophic damage on the lightly armored cruiser. The Japanese vessel had been designed to deliver punishment, not to endure it. Her armor, adequate against destroyer gunfire and shell fragments, offered no significant protection against direct hits from 6-inch armor-piercing projectiles. At 01:55 hours, a salvo from the Montpellier struck the Sendai's engineering spaces. The shells penetrated the thin deck armor and detonated amongst the boilers and turbines. Superheated steam, at 600 degrees Fahrenheit, exploded through the compartments, instantly killing every man stationed in the engineering spaces. The ship's power failed. The lights went out. The gun turrets ceased responding to training commands. The Sendai was dead in the water, listing to port with a fire spreading by the bow. Captain Kobayashi stood on what remained of his bridge and understood with absolute clarity that his ship was doomed. They had sailed into battle expecting to leverage their superior night-fighting techniques against an inferior American force. Instead, they had been detected at impossible distances, engaged before they could mount an effective counterfire, and struck repeatedly by an enemy they still couldn't clearly see. The Americans possessed some capability unknown to the Japanese, some technology that enabled them to fire accurately in complete darkness at extended ranges. The Sendai's surviving crew began abandoning ship at 02:10 hours. The cruiser remained afloat, burning until approximately 04:30 hours, when she finally rolled over and sank. Captain Kobayashi went down with his vessel, upholding the hallowed tradition of Japanese naval commanders. Over 300 members of the Sendai's crew of 500 men were dead or would perish in the water. Some were killed by the shell impacts. Others succumbed to the fires. Still others drowned when the ship went down. Some survivors were machine-gunned in the water by American destroyers during subsequent phases of the battle. This represented a grim reality of night combat, where distinguishing friend from foe was exceedingly difficult, and pausing to rescue enemy survivors could prove fatal. The battle raged for several more hours, devolving into a chaotic melee as Japanese destroyers launched torpedo attacks and American destroyers countered with their own torpedo runs. However, the fundamental character of the engagement had been irrevocably established within the first 15 minutes. The Americans could continuously track Japanese ship movements via radar. They could maintain firing solutions even as targets maneuvered. They could coordinate the firepower of multiple vessels against single targets, or distribute their fire effectively across multiple adversaries. The Japanese, in contrast, were fighting in the traditional manner, attempting to close the distance, seeking visual contact, and firing at gun flashes and estimated positions. Admiral Omori withdrew his remaining ships at approximately 02:30 hours, ordering a retirement towards Rabaul. He had lost one light cruiser sunk. The destroyer Hatsukaze was sunk by American destroyers during a confused engagement, and several other ships sustained damage. The Americans had damaged one destroyer, the Foot, which lost her stern to a Japanese torpedo but managed to survive. In terms of material losses, the battle was not catastrophically one-sided, but in terms of psychological impact and tactical demonstration, Empress Augusta Bay proved devastating. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the battle with unwavering confidence in their night-fighting superiority. They exited it having been ambushed, outfought, and driven off by an enemy employing methods they didn't comprehend and wielding capabilities they couldn't match. The sacred doctrine of night surface combat, honed over decades, practiced with religious fervor, and validated by victories such as Guadalcanal, had been rendered obsolete by American radar technology. Japanese after-action reports reflected profound confusion and uncertainty regarding the events that had transpired. How had the Americans detected them first? How had they achieved such accurate fire at such extended ranges? Some Japanese officers theorized that the Americans must have had submarines or aircraft providing targeting intelligence, failing to grasp that surface search radar could perform precisely that function. The concept that a ship could electronically see other vessels at 15 or 20,000 yards was utterly beyond the scope of Japanese naval doctrine at that time. The fundamental irony was complete. The Japanese had meticulously developed night combat doctrine specifically to counteract American material advantages. They had trained with greater intensity, developed superior optics, and constructed tactical systems around capabilities where they believed they could compete. However, technology had shifted the very arena of competition. American industrial capacity had produced not merely more ships and more guns, but entirely new capabilities that fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. Radar did not offer a mere incremental advantage. It provided categorical superiority in night combat, rendering decades of Japanese expertise and rigorous training as irrelevant as being the world's finest archer in the age of gunpowder. The surviving remnants of Admiral Omori's task force limped back towards Rabaul over the ensuing days. Damage reports were compiled, casualty figures tallied, and operational assessments meticulously written. The loss of the Sendai and Hatsukaze represented significant material damage, but the Imperial Japanese Navy had weathered worse defeats and recovered. What could not be so readily salvaged was the psychological bedrock of Japanese naval doctrine. Senior officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters pored over the battle reports from Empress Augusta Bay with escalating concern. The accounts from surviving officers described American gunfire of impossible accuracy in absolute darkness. Ships engaging at ranges where visual detection should have been utterly impossible. Coordinated fire from multiple vessels against specific targets without the use of searchlights or discernible communication. The pattern strongly suggested some advanced technological capability far beyond conventional optical equipment. Japanese intelligence was aware that the Americans possessed radar. Japanese ships had encountered American air search radar, and a few Japanese vessels were being retrofitted with their own early warning radar sets for detecting aircraft. However, the concept of employing radar for surface search and fire control had not been fully appreciated. Japanese radar development had primarily focused on air defense, mirroring what they understood to be the British and American approaches. The idea that radar could supersede optical rangefinders and visual observation for surface combat represented a conceptual leap that Japanese naval planning had not yet made. Technical intelligence officers meticulously examined captured American radar equipment recovered from downed aircraft and damaged ships. They studied the principles of operation, the frequencies employed, and the antenna designs. Japanese engineers understood the underlying physics. In theory, they could construct similar systems. However, comprehending a technology and deploying it effectively across an entire fleet were vastly different undertakings. By late 1943, Japan's industrial capacity was already severely strained by years of relentless warfare. Shipyards struggled to replace combat losses. Aircraft production consumed resources that might otherwise have been allocated to electronics manufacturing. The nation's technological base, while sophisticated, was smaller than America's, and lacked the surplus capacity to rapidly integrate new systems into existing designs. More fundamentally, Japanese naval doctrine required adaptation, and institutional change invariably lagged behind technological advancement. The entire tactical framework of night combat, the specialized training programs for lookouts, the design philosophy of cruiser bridges and optical equipment, the positioning of searchlights and illumination procedures, all of these were predicated on assumptions that radar had definitively invalidated. Re-educating an entire navy to fight differently, to trust electronic instruments over human eyesight, to abandon techniques that had previously yielded victory, required time that Japan simply did not possess. Admiral Omori never commanded another major surface force. He was not formally disciplined for the defeat at Empress Augusta Bay. The Japanese Naval Command recognized that he had faced an unexpected technological disadvantage, but his career had effectively concluded. He spent the remainder of the war in staff positions, his practical expertise in night combat rendered obsolete by circumstances he could not have foreseen. The Imperial Japanese Navy continued to attempt night surface actions in the ensuing months, most notably during the Battle of Cape St. George later in November 1943. The outcomes were distressingly similar. American destroyers, utilizing radar to track Japanese destroyer formations, ambushed and sank 3 Japanese destroyers without sustaining any losses. Once again, the Americans detected the Japanese first, achieved strategic surprise, and coordinated their attacks using electronic intelligence rather than visual observation. Japanese tactical responses evolved to account for American radar, but these were defensive adaptations rather than fundamental solutions. Japanese ships began implementing more frequent course changes to disrupt American fire control solutions. They employed smoke screens more extensively to break radar locks, although this also degraded their own ability to observe targets. Some Japanese commanders adopted more cautious approaches, actively avoiding night surface combat whenever possible. However, caution is not a viable winning strategy in a war where the enemy commands greater resources, produces more vessels, and can afford to pursue an aggressive stance while you cannot. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was profound. Sailors who had dedicated years to mastering night combat techniques discovered their skills had become irrelevant. The immense pride derived from mastering difficult optical range-finding or developing exceptional night vision meant nothing when the enemy could electronically perceive you before you could visually detect them. Morale deteriorated, not from simple defeat, but from the stark realization that the very nature of the contest had transformed into one where Japan's traditional advantages no longer held sway. Japanese destroyer and cruiser crews entering subsequent battles knew they were technologically outmatched. They understood that the Americans would detect them first, track them continuously, and coordinate attacks that Japanese forces were incapable of matching. Courage and training could not compensate for this fundamental disparity. Men still fought, still obeyed orders, and still executed their duties with the discipline and skill that Japanese naval service demanded. However, they fought with the gnawing knowledge that victory was improbable, and that they were employing tactics the enemy had already effectively countered with technology that Japan could neither match in time nor quantity against the United States Navy. Empress Augusta Bay served as a resounding validation for both the technology and the associated tactics that revolved around it. Radar-directed night combat proved its efficacy. The substantial investment in research, development, and fleet-wide installation of search and fire control radar had yielded decisive tactical advantages. The Combat Information Center concept, centralizing radar operators and tactical plotting within a dedicated space, had demonstrated its effectiveness. The seamless integration of radar data into fire control solutions had enabled remarkably accurate gunnery at ranges and in conditions where purely optical systems were rendered useless. Admiral Merrill received considerable praise for his skillful command of the battle, but he was careful to attribute success to the technology and the comprehensive training his crews had received. In his after-action report, he underscored the critical role of radar, noting that without it, the engagement would have been considerably more challenging and its outcome uncertain. He strongly recommended continued emphasis on radar training for all officers and enlisted personnel, and he proposed tactical enhancements based on the lessons learned during the engagement. The Navy's Bureau of Ships and Bureau of Ordnance took careful note. Production of SG radar sets was significantly increased. New variants were developed, featuring improved range and resolution. Fire control radar technology continued to be refined, with later models offering enhanced tracking capabilities and faster data processing. Every new cruiser and destroyer launched from American shipyards was equipped with the latest radar systems as standard equipment. Older vessels underwent extensive refits to install or upgrade their radar outfits. Training programs were expanded to keep pace with the technological advancements. Radar schools were established at shore installations, where operators learned to interpret complex displays, distinguish various contacts, and effectively manage the equipment. Combat Information Center teams practiced coordinating information flow and honing their tactical decision-making skills. Gunnery officers learned to place their trust in radar data, even when it appeared to contradict visual observations or traditional range-finding methods. The cultural shift from relying on visual perception to embracing electronic sensing required time, but the Navy diligently invested that time because the resulting benefits far outweighed the effort. The tactical advantages extended beyond the realm of night combat. Radar enabled American ships to track targets in adverse weather conditions, through rain squalls and fog, situations that rendered optical equipment nearly ineffectual. It provided invaluable early warning of approaching enemy forces, granting commanders ample time to strategically position their vessels advantageously. It revolutionized air defense by detecting incoming aircraft at ranges where visual spotting was impossible. It transformed navigation, allowing ships to fix their positions relative to coastlines and known landmarks, even in conditions of zero visibility. By 1944, American naval superiority in the Pacific was overwhelming, and radar constituted a significant cornerstone of that dominance. Japanese surface forces largely avoided major engagements, recognizing their inability to secure victory. When compelled to fight, as occurred during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, or the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese ships were systematically destroyed by American forces, capable of coordinating their movements, concentrating their firepower, and executing complex tactical maneuvers that would have been utterly impossible without radar. The technology also profoundly influenced American naval architecture and operational concepts. Cruisers and destroyers were designed with larger superstructures to accommodate radar antennas and house combat information centers. Bridge layouts evolved to seamlessly integrate radar displays with traditional navigation and ship control stations. Communication systems were enhanced to facilitate the sharing of radar information between ships, thereby creating a cohesive tactical picture that bestowed upon American commanders an unprecedented level of situational awareness. The disparity in capability was not subtle. American military planners regularly possessed precise intelligence regarding enemy troop locations, trajectories, and velocities, whereas Japanese commanders relied on scattered data acquired visually or through radio transmissions. American vessels navigated with a comprehensive grasp of the battlefield dynamics, contrasting with Japanese ships that moved based on limited knowledge and suppositions. This disparity culminated in a consistent American edge in nearly every naval engagement fought on the surface from the latter half of 1943 until the conflict's conclusion. Radar, moreover, exemplified a larger trend in the Pacific theater, a progressive enhancement of American technological and industrial capabilities. Early in the war, Japanese forces frequently held localized superiority in troop preparedness, weaponry, or combat strategies. However, American manufacturing prowess not only produced greater quantities of existing material, but also superior quality equipment. Radar was one such advancement. Other improvements included more advanced aircraft with enhanced engines and armaments, proximity-fused anti-aircraft projectiles, sophisticated targeting computers, superior damage control systems, more dependable engines, and submarines with extended operational ranges and improved torpedoes. These advantages accumulated across every facet of naval warfare. Japan struggled to keep pace with this developmental acceleration. Its constrained industrial capacity, coupled with resource scarcity intensified by American submarine operations, and the imperative to replace war losses, left minimal room for research, development, and widespread fleet deployment of new technologies. Japanese engineers and scientists grasped the underlying principles of radar and other American innovations. Japan boasted excellent programs in theoretical physics and engineering. Nevertheless, transforming theoretical concepts into mass-produced, fleet-ready technology necessitated an industrial infrastructure that Japan lacked and could not construct under wartime conditions. Consequently, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay represented not merely a tactical triumph, but also a clear manifestation of systemic advantages that would ultimately dictate the war's outcome. These advantages encompassed technology, industrial might, training protocols, tactical ingenuity, and the capacity for rapid implementation of enhancements across an entire naval force. In these domains, American superiority was decisive. Individual acts of Japanese bravery, tactical finesse, or operational planning were insufficient to overcome these systemic imbalances. On the evening of November 1st, 1943, Admiral Shinichi Hara led his cruiser flotilla into the fray, believing that the cover of darkness would be his strategic asset. He had every reason to hold this conviction. Japanese doctrines for night combat had been honed over many years, leading to victories at Savo Island and numerous smaller encounters. The Imperial Japanese Navy had structured its tactics, training, and ship designs on the premise that nocturnal engagements offered an arena where Japanese strengths in optics, training, and aggressive maneuvers could counteract American material advantages. By sunrise on November 2nd, the cruiser Sendai rested at the bottom of the Pacific, and that foundational premise had been as thoroughly shattered as the vessel itself. The Americans had not only achieved a battlefield victory, but had also demonstrated the obsolescence of Japan's entire naval doctrine. Radar had fundamentally altered the nature of maritime conflict, and Japan's inability to adapt swiftly enough proved fatal. The sailors who perished aboard the Sendai were not substandard in their training or equipment by their Navy's own benchmarks. They were highly skilled professionals. Lookout personnel, who had dedicated years to honing their observational capabilities, found their expertise suddenly irrelevant. Fire control teams, capable of calculating firing solutions with mechanical precision, could not detect targets that radar made visible to their adversaries. Gun crews, able to maintain rapid volleys, were firing at phantoms while American ordnance found its mark with unerring accuracy. They fought with courage and met their end with professional fortitude, victims not of personal failing but of technological obsolescence that was beyond their power to prevent. The irony is amplified when one considers that Japan's confidence was not entirely misplaced. Their night combat doctrine had proven remarkably effective against opponents who engaged on equal footing. At Savo Island, against Allied forces employing traditional optical systems and visual reconnaissance, Japanese tactics had been devastatingly successful. The doctrine was not flawed for the war Japan believed it was fighting, but for the conflict it found itself engaged in against an adversary possessing technological capabilities that redefined the rules of engagement. This represents a recurring tragedy from the Japanese perspective throughout the Pacific War. Excellence in one sphere could not compensate for deficiencies in others. Superior torpedo technology could not offset inferior radar capabilities. Enhanced optical equipment could not match electronic detection systems. Exceptional pilot training could not replace downed air crews as rapidly as American programs produced new aviators. Individual tactical advantages were systematically neutralized by America's industrial and technological might. For historians analyzing this engagement decades later, the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay stands as a definitive turning point. Prior to this clash, Japanese capabilities in night surface combat were regarded with respect and apprehension. Following it, American radar-guided tactics became the norm, and Japanese surface forces subsequently avoided major engagements during darkness whenever feasible. While the battle did not extinguish Japanese naval resistance, with significant confrontations continuing through 1944, it unequivocally ended the assumption of Japanese superiority in night fighting. The technological implications extended far beyond naval warfare. Radar's success in nocturnal combat was indicative of a broader trend where electronic systems supplemented or superseded human capacities across various military operations. Radio navigation systems supplanted celestial navigation. Electronic fire control systems replaced mechanical calculators. Radio communication superseded visual signaling. Each of these advancements diminished the value of traditional skills while elevating the importance of technological infrastructure and the industrial capacity to produce it. The individuals trained as expert visual observers, capable of identifying ship outlines in darkness or calculating distances with optical instruments, possessed genuine expertise that held significant worth within its context. However, the context shifted with unprecedented speed, outpacing the ability of these skills to adapt. This is the fundamental tragedy of technologically driven warfare. The years invested in mastering a craft can become obsolete overnight when technology renders that craft superfluous. The lookouts aboard the Sendai had performed every task their training had instilled. It proved insufficient because the Americans were not adhering to the same established norms. Admiral Hara sailed northward that November night, anticipating the deployment of Japanese strengths to exploit a weakness in American defenses, night combat, where visual acuity and training were purported to outweigh numerical superiority. He returned having discovered that American technology had utterly eliminated that very vulnerability. The lesson was stark, brutal, and ultimately conclusive. In industrialized warfare between modern nations, technological and material advantages escalate incrementally until tactical skill and bravery alone are inadequate for achieving victory. The verdant luminescence emanating from the radar screens within the Montpellier's Combat Information Center symbolized more than mere navigational assistance or a tool for targeting. It represented a profound transformation in the conduct of warfare, shifting the paradigm from human perception and skill to technological systems and industrial capacity. The side possessing superior technology, manufactured in greater quantities, deployed more extensively, and supported by consistent training and doctrine, gains advantages that individual excellence cannot surmount. The crew of the Sendai never stood a chance, not due to any lack of preparedness or competent leadership, but because they were engaged in a conflict their equipment was incapable of winning. Such is the unyielding arithmetic of technologically advanced warfare. Training is crucial, courage is essential, and tactical acumen is vital. However, when one side possesses the ability to observe while the other remains blind, and when one side can deliver accurate fire in absolute darkness while the other relies on estimations and guesswork, the outcome is predetermined. The engagement itself lasted a mere few hours, but its implications resonated throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. Technological evolution outpaces doctrinal adaptation in warfare, and the entity that fails to adjust engages at a disadvantage that valor and skill alone cannot overcome.